Well, gun violence has been on the rise in the country, with many people losing their lives. The latest crime stats, more than 7,000 people were killed by other persons in the second quarter of the 2022-2023 financial year. This is an increase of 841 more people murdered compared to the same period in 2021, when the country was placed under COVID-19 lockdown. Now, in many instances, the majority of these murders were committed using guns, many of which are illegal. But how do we turn the tide? Let's discuss this with Jenni Irish-Gqobosheane. She's a researcher at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Jenni, good afternoon. Welcome to Today here on eNCA. Thank you very much for your time. I guess top of mind around gun violence, for example, follows the shooting at a school in Kagiso last Friday, allegedly by an educator against an intruder in the school. And we're just wondering, how can we turn the tide against gun violence in our country? What is your research showing you?
I think our research is showing us that one of the biggest problems facing this country is the availability of illicit firearms. Obviously, in the school shooting, it was more than likely a legal firearm carried by a teacher, and there may have been an argument for self-defense, so that would have been different. But we're seeing increasing numbers of crimes being committed with firearms. So if you look at the increase in hijackings, if you look at the increase in cash in transit, business robberies, house robberies, very often firearms are used in those instances. And one of the biggest problems is that we have a growing pool of illicit firearms, many of which are coming from domestic sources that we need to be shutting down.
What are those sources?
So if you look at where the firearms are coming from, we do still have some firearms that are smuggled into the country across the border, but not anything like the numbers we saw in the past. The majority of the firearms that we're seeing in the illicit pool are actually from domestic sources. Those would be firearms lost or stolen by civilian firearm owners. There would also be, and more concerning, firearms lost or stolen from the state. So that would be police-issued firearms that go missing, army firearms that go missing, firearms that go missing from the evidence stores. We all are aware of what happened in Norwood, where there were 170 firearms that went missing from their evidence stores, and then also firearms that go missing from other government departments. And that is a big concern for us, because those firearms, we would expect the state to have greater control over those firearms and the ammunition that accompanies those firearms.
Does gun ownership need tighter regulations?
I think that there are areas where we could be looking at tightening up some of the legislation with regard to civilian ownerships, and there's no doubt that that's something that is in discussion at the moment. But I think it's also critically important that we tighten up controls within the state. We need to be demanding that there is greater accountability for the loss of firearms by state officials.
Yeah, and if firearms can disappear from a storeroom of a police station like it happened in Norwood, we should really be concerned, because those firearms inevitably end up in the wrong hands.
Exactly, and many of those firearms wouldn't simply be handguns. Some of them would be semi-automatic AK-47s, R4s, R5s that have been seized by the police and taken into evidence.
Yeah, should there be also harsher consequences here, Jenni, for if people have transgressed one or other regulation, especially as you said, some of the firearms are finding themselves in circulation in criminal hands from government?
There absolutely have to be greater consequences. When it comes to the police, the loss of police-issued firearms and the number of police that have been convicted in disciplinary hearings as a result of those loss of firearms is incredibly low. When it comes to other government departments, I think very often they treat the loss of a firearm the same way they would treat the loss of a pen or a chair in their office, as an asset that has been lost. But it's actually a dangerous weapon, and it needs to be considered as such. And anybody who possesses a weapon, whether they be a civilian or a state or from a state entity, there must be consequences if firearms are negligently lost or stolen.
Yeah, there were a few years ago. Was there no campaign by government to collect all illegal firearms and give people amnesty? And they were supposed to have got rid of those firearms. Do we need another campaign to reduce gun violence, but that's specifically focused on the proliferation of illegal guns?
You see, I think the amnesty processes that we've had, and we've had a number since 1994, which have collected a significant number of firearms. But many of those are not the firearms that are being used in the commission of crimes, because those criminals, firstly, are not going to hand in the firearm because the firearm will be tested and they will be charged if the firearm has been used in a crime. And secondly, because those firearms are a means of committing their crimes and of accessing resources for their crimes. So I think that yes, gun amnesties do work, but then we need to have tight control over what happens to the firearms handed in, because there have been instances where amnesty firearms handed in have found their way back into criminal hands after being handed in. So that we need to tighten up that. Amnesties are one solution, but we also need to start looking at closing the tap. And if you look at the police crime statistics, there are a number of arrests and seizures of illicit firearms, but we're not making a dent on the pool, because as fast as the police are seizing firearms, there are also firearms being lost by civilians and the state. So we need to close the tap of firearms flowing into the illicit pool.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for your time this afternoon here on Today. That's Jenni Irish-Gqobosheane, a researcher at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, just putting under the spotlight the issue of the increasing gun violence in South Africa. And she says the main reason is the proliferation of illegal firearms.